Okay, hopefully you've watched the first video about all of the events leading up to 1917, including the 1905 revolution. Just to very briefly recap where we're up to, Russia is in the middle of World War One, and the Tsar has literally abandoned Parliament. He's essentially he's abandoned the capital city to make himself the leader of the war and the army efforts, leaving the Tsarina in charge. And this was problematic because of a number of reasons, including a lack of trust from the people because of her German heritage and her relationship with Rasputin. And so this video is going to talk about 1917, just to end the area of study. And 1917 is a big year because there were, in fact, two revolutions. So we'll see there was one in February, and then there was a second revolution in October. And this is when the Bolsheviks took charge. And this October revolution is what triggers area of study 2. It's the consequences of the revolution. So both were successful. But the October is the one that sort of stuck around. So we're going to start at February. So the First World War, again, just to recap, it's having a significant effect on Russia. We've got a huge number of people who are dead, and there's also economic chaos. It was incredibly detrimental. The Russian army didn't have much money to begin with, and now all of their funds were being funneled towards the war effort. And so because of that, we can see there was a strike on the 23rd of February where women in St. Petersburg went on strike to protest, demanding bread and peace. And this was the kickstart to the revolution that triggered it. And the Tsarina, who we remember was in charge now, she wasn't too concerned about this. We can read here this quote where she kind of said that it was a hooligan movement, that people were just crazily shouting about bread to try and stop work, but that it will all end as long as the Duma does its job. And remember that Alexandra doesn't actually respect the Duma, and she doesn't particularly like them making decisions. So we had those protests starting in February, and remember that in the Northern Hemisphere this is winter. And this winter was one of the coldest on record. And we can see here it was as low as minus 35 degrees Celsius. Ooh, I'm recording this on a 20-degree day, and it's kind of chilly. But the cold was actually really significant. It halted the Russian transportation system, and it exacerbated the food and fuel shortages that were already in existence because of the war, where any food and fuel that is produced is diverted to the war effort first before the people of Russia. And then we have our old friend, the Pudilov steel factory. And remember, this factory was vital in the revolution of 1905. It was a strike at this factory that led to the Bloody Sunday March, which ended up being a massacre. And here it's more, because it's so cold, they're not able to do their jobs effectively. And they're shut down. So thousands of workers who, you can imagine, just because the factory shut down, they're not getting any compensation for this. They're now not being paid, and they've been thrust onto the streets of Petrograd. And so we've got all of these workers on the streets. We've had different protests, and as well another protest started to memorialize the 12-year anniversary of Bloody Sunday, and then other strikes in February, such as at the Pudilov steel factory. So I'm kind of recapping the ones that I've already discussed, but then again on the 23rd of February on International Women's Day, we had that March for Peace and Bread. They were also joined by a number of men, but they were more concerned about the peace and the bread than women. And this is an important one to remember. I would memorize this 23rd of February Women's Day protest, because the next day the number of protests doubled, and these protests were anti-war and anti-Tsar. So by the end of February, it is freezing Virtually all the factories are closed. There's almost 500,000 protesters in the streets of Petrograd, and the Tsar is not there. Alexandra is like, it's not a big deal, they're just trying to get out of work. The Tsar is also given bad advice. He's told that it's minor, it's controllable, and so he ordered that the strikes be quashed. So the Tsar's man banned public gatherings, and he did warn the protesters that they would be shot if they continued, and the crowds continued, and so there were several instances where people were injured or killed for their role protesting. So we can see at the end of February is where things really kick off, triggered by that Women's Day protest. And ultimately by the 27th of February, the Petrograd garrison has mutinied. So these were the soldiers in Petrograd waiting to be deployed, waiting to protect the capital. And so it's really significant that we have this group of soldiers are mutinying. They are directly opposing their government, where a soldier is meant to do anything to support their government. And so the people that were in this garrison, this army building, were primarily peasants and workers who were waiting to go to war. And we can see here that they were in barracks designed to fit 20,000 people, but there were 160,000 people. So we can imagine that conditions in this garrison are quite terrible. There's probably not enough food to eat, and you probably have many, many people sharing rooms. So they saw the violence from our old friend Kabalov, and they were outraged by this, and that inspired them to join the protesters. Here we have a quote that might be good to remember from a sergeant in the barracks who noted that they were killing innocent people, our brothers and our sisters. Now, so these 160,000 men, and I guess it's more important that we call them soldiers, the fact that they've now defected and are ignoring the Tsar's instructions, this is going to be the a main cause of the downfall of the Romanov dynasty, because the Tsar no longer has no military authority in the capital, and we now have 160,000 trained men with weapons in Petrograd ready to fight with the protesters. And hopefully we remember this man. He is Mikhail Radzienko, and he was the president of the Fourth Duma. And we remember that the Fourth Duma was weakened significantly as the Tsar had limited who was allowed to vote, who was eligible to vote. So it wasn't a particularly strong Duma, and they were very Tsarist. But even here, they are criticizing the Tsar. And he's saying that the cause of these protests is a shortage of bread, the economic challenges brought about as a result of World War I specifically. However, he then goes on to say, but the actual main reason is that they no longer trust the authorities, the Tsar, and the Tsarina, who they argue are not competent to lead the country out of the situation. And so here, the president of the Duma is saying that we need to have immediately a person in charge who the whole country will trust. Now, imagine what the Tsar is going to think when he reads this or hears about it, because it kind of sounds like the president of the Duma, which is a Tsar-positive body, is basically calling for a coup, for a revolution, and saying that the Russians need a new leader who the people can trust. How do you think the Tsar is going to respond? Surprise, surprise, he dismisses the Duma. So we have someone saying, well, the people can't trust the authority of the Tsar, and the Tsar basically does exactly what everyone predicted that he would. He dismisses the Duma and thereby removes people's representation. But the Duma were like, no thank you. In fact, the Duma basically said, So the Duma, even though they were officially dismissed by the Tsar, they formed a group of 12 members from the Duma to be a provisional committee. And their aim was to restore order within Petrograd. On the same day, the 27th, We also had the establishment of the Petrograd Soviet of Soldiers. Remember, a Soviet is a form of government. And this was essentially workers and soldiers all arrived at a building, and they essentially formed their own form of government. They were in support temporarily of the Provisional Committee, and they called for immediate elections. We're going to talk a little bit more about these guys after the revolution, the February, is kind of finalized. So just to recap, here we have two groups who are in charge, and they're actually quite different. So the Provisional Government is mostly middle class, and if we remember from these pictures, let me find the pictures actually. Here is an image of the Provisional Government, and you can see they have a lot in common. We've got a fairly quiet room full of white men, and that is in opposition directly to the Petrograd Soviet, which we can see all of these little heads. There's a significant number of people in the Petrograd Soviet. We're going to come back to those two forms of government when they are a bit more relevant later, but let's get back into our timeline. So 28th of February, Nicholas's ministers stepped down, and many of them fled Petrograd, knowing that they could potentially be captured or injured for their role in the Tsarist government. And the Provisional Government makes a proclamation that essentially says, you know, we are the new government of Russia. We also have on the 13th of March, at Kronstadt. Now remember, this is not the Kronstadt Rebellion. That comes after the revolution, but it's almost a precursor to that because it is a rebellion in some form. The sailors on this naval base, which we remember is so close to the Petrograd, to the Capitol building, these sailors mutinied and they murdered hundreds of their officers, and they're now on the side of the revolutionaries. They no longer support the Tsar. And this leads to basically what ends the February Revolution, and that is the abdication of the Tsar. Here's a quote: "It is necessary for Russia's good that I step aside. I am prepared to do so." So, how does this decision happen? Nicholas returns to Petrograd to try and settle the crowds, to slow down the revolution, but the soldiers who are mutinying refuse to let him pass on their train. They are in charge of the railroads now. He abdicates on March 2nd in favor of his son, who's like 5. But then the doctor is like, Alexei's gonna die. And the Tsar is like, oh, okay, I'll give it to my brother. He maybe should have given it to his brother anyway, because again, Alexei was really young, and I don't think he was the person who was really capable and equipped of taking Russia out of revolution. This is an interesting historical opinion, was that the Tsar's motivation in abdication was not necessarily to do the best for Russia, but that he didn't want to be separated from his family, and that he prioritized them above all else, including Russia. Mikhail, who was the little brother of Tsar Nicholas, declines the crown, and he signs a formal abdication, which ended 300 years of Romanov rule. And that is the February Revolution. There was celebration in Russia, across this country, of the abdication, people flying flags. Some people, more traditional people, were concerned because the Tsar, as you remember, was literally placed in charge of Russia by God, and so they weren't really sure what the future would hold. Symbols of Tsarism, signs and statues were immediately destroyed, and the new interim government, the Provisional Government, were approved internationally. So let's recap the February Revolution. It began as a public strike about food and fuel shortages on International Women's Day, the 23rd of February in Petrograd. This was coupled with the steel factories being closed, which meant that there were a lot more people in the city and a lot more people who were dissatisfied. Secondly, war and mismanagement caused the transport system to fail, so food was especially scarce. Then these protests became more and more widespread. The generals who were told to quash these protests through violence did so, and yet the protests went on, and so the Tsar instead dissolved the Duma. This was ignored, and the Duma formed their own government. Soldiers were ordered by the Tsar to fire on civilians, but they refused, and soldiers around the country mutinied. An example is those on the Kronstadt naval base, the sailors who mutinied. So just one more recap of the revolution in February. Russia is in critical condition. There are no key leaders in Petrograd. The Tsarina is in charge. Lenin and his revolutionaries are in exile, so that's why they are not going to be in charge after this revolution. The Tsar is at war. There were significant food shortages. Petrograd was receiving only 20% of its daily flour supply. You can imagine that it would be worse in rural areas. There are also fuel shortages, and this was exacerbated by the cold. They needed fuel to keep warm. Of the 73 factories that had been closed down by December 1916, 50 were closed down because they didn't have the fuel required to power machinery. The February Revolution was spontaneous, it was popular and unorganized. And by popular I mean there was widespread support. There were up to 500,000 protesters in Petrograd. It began as a riot about the unavailability of meat and bread. The fact that it was in winter exacerbated the problems, and specifically that the railway connections were cut, making transport of food even harder. The Tsar ignored all warnings and instead ordered the Petrograd garrison, the soldiers, to enforce order, which ultimately led to them mutinying. The Duma began to replace ministers, so Nicholas ordered the dissolution of the Duma, and Nicholas ultimately decided to abdicate. And there are different change of thoughts about this decision. Some people think that Nicholas abdicating was an honorable thing to do, as seen in this propaganda. He was doing what he could for Russia. Other people viewed it more as the Tsar being pushed out rather than choosing to go, and that if he didn't abdicate, he would have been executed or forced off the throne. And so that is the February Revolution, and there's some differing opinions about it. Chamberlain, the historian, says that it was spontaneous and leaderless, and it was just sort of a thing of luck that all of these conditions, the bad weather, the strikes, and the Women's Day, all kind of happened at the right time, leading to revolution. Trotsky tries to take a little bit of ownership, saying that it was actually planned, it was totally planned, and the Bolsheviks organized this. And the Bolsheviks also argued that the February Revolution was inevitable due to the nature of Tsarism. And to summarize this whole revolution, these are what are largely attributed to as the causes of the February Revolution. So we have the long-term political problems that lie in Tsarism, in its very nature, which excludes so many people from Russia. And the Tsar's own leadership, he wasn't very well connected with the Russian people and didn't know what they wanted. He also, when leaving for World War I, left the Tsarina in charge, which had a very negative impact upon Russia. Another long-term cause is the economic problems. These have always been embedded in Russian society. And even though there was some relative peace and improvement under Stolypin, and then Sergei Witte, economically Russia was still in bad shape. These economic problems were made worse during wartime, where 1/3 of able-bodied men are at war, meaning there are less people on farms or in factories. Additionally, by 1916, food prices have risen to 4 times higher than pre-war. This leads to an increase in strikes. So the primary trigger cause of the February Revolution was the strikes. The short-term cause was peasant and worker discontent. Finally, we have the impact of World War I, so the Tsar's absence and the Tsarina's role in leading the country. And that is the February Revolution. So now, following the Tsar's abdication, we have two new political systems that have formed, and we already kind of touched on these earlier. And the months following the February Revolution saw these two groups fighting to become the main system of government. So those two groups were the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet. And when we compare these two committees, we'll remember that the Provisional Committee were unelected, and they were given authority by the Duma, who were essentially the Tsar's government. So a lot of people were not supportive of the Provisional Government. They had political power, but they lacked popular support. This is in direct contrast with the Petrograd Soviet, who were made up of Menshevik socialist revolutionaries, soldiers, workers, but they didn't have any official authority or power. What they did have was popular support. They were backed by the masses. So just to remind you, the difference between these two groups, the Provisional Committee had political authority and power, but lacked popular support, whereas the Petrograd Soviet had lots of support, as we can see in this picture, but lacked political power. Now, the Provisional Government is being run by Alexander Kerensky, who was opposed to the Tsar, but at the same time was still fairly wealthy. Now, the Provisional Government believed that they would just be temporary until something more permanent came along. Ultimately, we'll see that something more permanent did come along in the form of the October Revolution. So this period of the video so it's about 20 minutes in, is going to clarify what happens between the February Revolution and October that results in the October Revolution. Now, even though they didn't have official power, the Petrograd Soviet were able to use some forms of power. They were very influential, and because of their members, remember, soldiers, workers, railway workers, etc., they were able to control a lot of things, such as the army, railways, communications. And essentially what they did was they wrote demands that were intended to limit the power of the Provisional Government. And so remember, they had power without authority, whereas the Provisional Government had authority without power. So the Provisional Government passed some policies that essentially intended to give full freedom of speech, of press, of strike to the people of Russia. Historian Robert Service said that because of this, Russia was seen as freer than any other country. They wanted to have elections, they wanted even elected soldiers, and they wanted to elect a constituent assembly of representatives for the whole country. And once they had the constituent assembly, the aim was that the Provisional Government would no longer be needed. So if we have a look at our timeline, here we have the Tsar abdicating on the 3rd of March. It's important to remember that date where possible, which establishes the crisis of dual authority. We have these two different groups, the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government, in charge. What we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is in April, Lenin returns and writes the April Theses. And this is going to kickstart the possibility of a new revolution in October. So even though the Provisional Government were trying to make things better by increasing freedoms and civil liberties for Russians, there were some significant problems. They had a weak foundation. Many people saw them as gaining power by default. They weren't elected. Because of World War I, even though they didn't choose to enter it, they had to deal with the consequences, which were that they were bankrupt, soldiers wanted to quit, but if they left the war, they would have to forfeit the loans, and they would have to pay back a significant amount of debt very quickly, as well as alienate the foreign countries who had helped them in the war. We're going to see a problem in June, was the June offensive, in which they tried to boost morale during wartime, but it failed drastically. Food and fuel shortages remained, and they were alienating their upper and working class. And here's our good quote. In order to survive, the Provisional Government needed to keep Russia in the war because they couldn't afford to pay back all the money. But in doing so, they were destroying their own chances of survival. One thing the Provisional Government did was they said that political prisoners or people who'd been exiled were allowed to return to Russia. And they released political prisoners. So that means Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky all return to Russia. So The provisional government also passed policies giving freedom of speech and press, which means that Lenin can now speak openly and aggressively about the provisional government. So the provisional government, even though they're doing the right thing, it's kind of backfired on them. They're saying, we're not going to have political prisoners anymore, you have the right to say whatever you want. And this is essentially going to spell their downfall, because this allows Lenin to come back to Russia and say whatever he wants. And what he does say is the provisional government is not suitable in giving peace land and bread to the Russians. So remember, he was on a train, he gets off, and he delivers this really long speech, or this really powerful speech, which has a lot of people listening. And in this, he says, he gives two main points. He says peace land and bread, and he also says all power to the Soviets. He wants the Bolsheviks, so he says Soviets, but he really means the Bolsheviks, and he wants them to be the only political power in the country. This is cute. The provisional government after the February Revolution in 1917, Lenin had never seen such a mess. So the day after his speech, he wrote a document known as the April Theses. There are lots of videos you can watch about the April Theses. I recommend this one. This is the, what is it called? The picture. The thumbnail. This is the thumbnail. It's called Lenin's April Theses. Essentially, the key ideas of the April Theses were to criticize the provisional government, calling them parliamentary bourgeois. So saying they're no better than the bourgeoisie, but worse, in fact, because they have power. And he declared that there should be no support for this government. He demanded an end to the war, which he viewed as imperialist. He felt that Russia was only in there for the wrong reasons. He reiterated his points of peace, bread and land, and all power to the Soviets. And people were quite critical of the April Theses, including fellow Bolsheviks. However, ultimately, the theses were more readily accepted by people, and they united the Bolshevik Party and kind of set them up to be the radical opponents of the provisional government. So now we have the provisional government versus the Bolsheviks. And because he was so pro-Soviet, saying all power to the Soviets, which includes the Mensheviks, the SRs, that allowed him to gain support from other political groups outside of the Bolsheviks, which is going to help significantly in the October Revolution. So the next event following the February Revolution that is significant after the April Theses is the June Offensive, also known as the Kerensky Offensive. So remember, Kerensky is essentially in charge of the provisional government, and he has some goals. He decides he's going to strengthen Russian army morale, strengthen the provisional government, and prove that Russia had the most democratic army in the world. So the June Offensive was a Russian military offensive operation in which Kerensky ordered the attack of German army. And they were initially successful. They were successful for a few days. However, by the third or fourth day, the soldiers refused to get out of the trenches, and the Russian soldiers, and fight. The Russian soldiers mutinied, ultimately leading to 400,000 deaths. So the Russian army was forced to retreat, and they were counterattacked. So even though Kerensky's goal was to strengthen the army, it had the exact opposite effect. The outcome was that it weakened how the provisional government were viewed, because they were no longer viewed as people who could handle military strategy. And this legitimized the possibility of a Bolshevik coup, a Bolshevik takeover, because it showed that the provisional government not only lacked military strategy, but they didn't even have the support of the military, so it would be easy for Bolsheviks to take over. And the provisional government is going to start to collapse. And this collapse, as a result of the June Offensive, became known as the July Days, from the 3rd to the 6th of July. So the country is in turmoil. We have hundreds of thousands of workers who are fired, and daily protests since February. The July Days were sort of 500,000 protesters descended on Petrograd, and they were disorganized, they were undisciplined, they had no leader, many of them were drunk, but it showed that there was a great opposition to the provisional government. In fact, the July Days were almost a revolution in themselves, but it was unsuccessful, in part because of these reasons, the lack of organization. We had another mutiny in Petrograd, where sailors now are taking control of the base and murdering people. They're establishing their own form of direct democracy. Things are not calm in Petrograd. And so there were essentially, like I said, a mob of 500,000 people waiting in Petrograd, and they were waiting to overthrow the provisional government. But the biggest failure is that no leader stepped forward. In fact, one member of the crowd is said to have yelled at the Bolsheviks, at Lenin and Trotsky, "Take power when it is handed to you." Lenin did get up there, but he was pretty quick because he didn't actually think it was the right time for a revolution. The mob scattered and the provisional government reinforcements arrived, crushing the uprising. They actually killed 700 people and arrested 1,000 Bolsheviks. So to recap, the July days were a spontaneous uprising of workers and soldiers in protest of the provisional government, sparked by opposition to Russia's involvement in the war, particularly the June offensive. And so that's what this is, the major offensive. That's a June offensive, and the collapse of government. There were at least 100,000 people, some sources say 500,000 people, calling for the Bolsheviks or the Soviets to seize power. But the Soviet leaders refused to take command of this uprising, in part because they weren't ready. The Bolsheviks took the blame for this, and because it was seen as quite bad that they'd almost had a revolution but weren't able to do it. Now the provisional government is stronger, people are dying. It wasn't a good look. And Lenin actually flees. So, following the February Revolution, we've had Lenin's return in the April Theses, the June Offensive, a failure that fuels supporters of Lenin and opponents of the provisional government. We had the July Day protests, which were close to a revolution, but lacked the organization to fully go through. And now we're going to talk about the Kornilov Revolt. Now, Kornilov was just some random dude. He was a Russian general, but he was just this random dude with a nice mustache and some cute jewelry. And he was like, well, the July Days failed. I don't really like the provisional government. I'm going to seize some power. So Kornilov was not particularly thrilled with the July Days or the June Offensive, and so he asked the provisional government to reintroduce the death penalty for army soldiers who did not follow discipline. He wanted to ban strikes, and he wanted to reduce the power held by the Petrograd Soviet, and they already didn't have much. Kerensky then appointed Kornilov as the supreme commander of the Russian army. This is another bad decision on Kerensky's part, because as we're going to see, their relationship was not very strong, and Kornilov actively set out to undermine the stability of the government. They didn't really get along. Kornilov asked Kerensky for a meeting, and Kerensky thought it was a plot to get rid of him and have a coup, so he basically forced all of his ministers to resign, and he was now a dictator. Again, bad choice, Kerensky. He fired Kornilov and demanded that he come to Petrograd, and Kornilov believed that this was a result of a Bolshevik coup, and so he ordered his troops to march to the capital. So now Kornilov is starting a coup. Kornilov and his followers are marching towards Petrograd. Kerensky asks the Soviets for help, and he gives them some weapons. And again, another mistake on Kerensky's part. So the Soviets organized militia, they used the weapons they'd been given by the provisional government, and prepared to fight Kornilov, but it was ultimately unnecessary because railway workers were like, no, there's no coup, you don't need to defend anything. Kornilov is arrested and imprisoned. So our key points: Kornilov was a conservative proponent of the Tsar who was appointed to command the army in July 1917. He instead wanted to impose martial law with execution of people who disagreed with him and the government's policies. He was fired by Kerensky, and through some sort of misunderstandings believed that it was needed for him to go and seize control of Petrograd, which gave weapons to the Soviets. And it further weakened the provisional government. The Bolsheviks were able to use this to increase their membership, and again, they now had weapons they could use in a revolution. So from about June, the Bolsheviks are suddenly gaining a lot of support. And here are 5 reasons for that. 1, the army is demoralized because of the June offensive. And we can see evidence here. There were 44 Bolshevik groups within the army in July, and that had more than doubled to 108 Bolshevik groups in the army by September. They were viewed as defenders of Petrograd because they were ready to stop Kornilov, even though it wasn't necessary in the end. And they promoted themselves as true revolutionaries. They gained the majority in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, which are the governments of people. And Trotsky is even elected chairman of the Soviet. And this leads us to the October Revolution. Now, unlike the July days, and even unlike the February Revolution, the October Revolution was much more organized and planned and prepared. So Lenin, who we remember has fled to Finland, he's literally like writing on this tree stump to the Bolsheviks in Russia, saying that we must immediately prepare to overthrow the government. And that's because he knows that there's going to be elections held for a constituent assembly in November. And if they didn't have a revolution before then, if they didn't receive the votes in the election, it would be harder for them to legitimize their power. If they were to have a revolution afterwards, it would be seen as like poor grapes. So instead, he proposed that they have a revolution before those elections were held. And so in early October, Lenin secretly returns to Russia and eventually persuades Congress that takeover is necessary, and the plans begin. There's about 2 weeks of planning, and Kerensky has some idea of this planning that is happening and says that those who dare lift their hand against the state could potentially suffer severe consequences. He shuts down newspapers, he cuts telephone wires, and he sends people to guard the Winter Palace, but he doesn't give them machine guns or heavy artillery. However, remember during the Kornilov affair, he did give machine guns and heavy artillery to the Soviets. So on October 25th, the Bolsheviks strike. And it was quite quick, the whole thing. It was only sort of overnight. The Red Guards and the sailors gained control of key infrastructure in Petrograd. At night, they moved towards the provisional government and surrounded the Winter Palace. And that was essentially that. By capturing Petrograd and the Winter Palace and arresting the provisional government, the Bolsheviks were now in power, and that's the end of the area of study. Pause this to have a read, and then I'm going to quickly summarize the difference between the 2 revolutions. Now, I don't know who decided that academic PowerPoints belonged on, like, 90s themed purple, but the info is good. So, the similarities between February and October. They're both fueled by a lack of food, broken promises from government, and anti-war. Remember, the provisional government doesn't leave the war. The government is doing a bad job, Russia, and exacerbating already poor conditions. In both February and October, the army mutinies against the people in charge. Firearms were used in both revolutions, and those in power gave it up. So the Tsar abdicates and the provisional government surrenders and allows himself to be arrested. In both cases, conditions were so poor that revolution seemed inevitable. Differences: the October Revolution was much less bloody and faster than the February Revolution. Ignore the dates here. The study design says February and October. The February Revolution was not organized by revolutionaries, it was spontaneous by workers and soldiers, whereas the October Revolution was planned and led by revolutionaries. The February Revolution ended autocracy with the abdication of the Tsar and the end of the Romanov Empire. However, the October Revolution kind of kick-started autocracy again in the form of communism, where now the Bolsheviks are in charge. In February, they used ammunition. In October, they didn't really need to. Key: February, not planned, not organized. October, planned. February, no order, spontaneous. October, order, controlled firearms.